These are the origins of Russia's most important holiday, День Победы, Victory Day. In Russia, May 9th commemorates the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in World War II, what Russians call the Great Patriotic War, or Великая Отечественная война. But for a war that shaped the world, somehow in America we were never taught about the ones who lost the most and still emerged victorious. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history, and just one piece of a larger plan, Generalplan Ost, the master plan for the East. Its goal? To wipe out the Russian people, seize their land for Lebensraum, living space, and repopulate it with Hitler's so-called Aryan master race. The Soviet Union was to be emptied, not through evacuation, but through extermination, so that the land could be claimed, as if the people who lived there had never existed. Nazi propaganda was systematically fed to the German people, taught in children's schools, broadcast in films and over the radio, preached at rallies. An entire generation was raised with one message all around them. Slavic people were not human. They were called die Untermenschen, which translates as the subhumans. The German people were told that exterminating them was not murder. It was a sacred duty. 6 weeks before Operation Barbarossa even began, German General Erich Honecker issued this order. The war against Russia is an essential chapter in the struggle for existence of the German people. It is the old struggle of the Germanic people against the Slavs. This struggle must aim at the annihilation of today's Russia and must therefore be waged with unparalleled harshness. Every combat action must in its planning and execution be guided by the iron will toward the merciless and complete annihilation of the enemy. In particular, there is to be no mercy for the carriers of the present Russian Bolshevist system. One of the most widely distributed books was titled Der Untermensch, the Subhuman. Nearly 4 million copies were printed and distributed across occupied Europe. Published by the SS itself, it described Slavic people in its own words. That biologically seemingly same-shaped creation of nature with hands, feet, a kind of brain, with eyes and mouth, is nonetheless a totally different terrible creature, and only an approximation of man, with human-like facial features. Spiritually and psychologically, however, stands lower than any animal. Inside this being lies a cruel chaos of wild, uninhibited passions, a will for nameless destruction, most primitive desires, most undisguised vulgarity, a subhuman, nothing else, for not everything with a human face is equal. The same book looked at the vast Russian landscape and claimed, "On the infinite steppes of Russian territory lies Eastern Europe. The land sees only chaos and waste because it is not cared for by true man. Certainly, the developed peoples of Central and Western Europe wanted to secure this land. It was their purpose." Their images and videos deliberately contrasted tiny Russian villages with the cityscapes of Berlin instead of cities like Moscow. The overall message was that the beautiful, fertile land, perfect for farming and with an almost endless supply of oil and other natural resources, was being squandered by the people living on it. This was land that could be used by the Germans. They only needed to get rid of the people already living there. And so, German soldiers were told that by eliminating the people who lived there, each of them would receive a plot of land in the conquered Soviet territory. It was a personal incentive designed to intensify their commitment and effort. With this in mind, millions of German troops poured across the Soviet border, What followed was among the worst atrocities in modern history. The Germans called this type of war Vernichtungskrieg, which in English means war of annihilation or war of extermination, a specific type of war in which the goal is complete extermination of a people or ethnic group. 27 million Soviets were killed, a modest estimate. More than 2/3 of all lives lost were citizens. Nearly 5 million Soviet people were stolen from their homes and forced into Nazi camps. 5.7 million Soviet soldiers were captured and placed in Nazi camps as well. In these camps, millions of Soviets perished from starvation, disease, being overworked, and routine mass killings by gas chamber. Soviets were the first tattooed with numbers and the first used in Zyklon B gas testing. Entire villages were burned to the ground, often with families locked inside their homes. Other villages were rounded up and marched to killing sites, where they were forced to dig their own mass graves, stripped of clothes and valuables, organized into groups at the edge of the pits, and shot. Many saw family members die before their own execution. Cities like Leningrad were deliberately starved. Over 1 million people died of starvation in that one city alone. And while the Soviet people were starving, the Nazis were stealing their surplus food and shipping it back to Germany, part of what they called der Hungerplan, the hunger plan. In the West, when we think of the horrors of World War II, one group is always memorialized. Over 6 million Jews were systematically murdered by the Nazis, a horrific tragedy that should never be forgotten. But what few in the West realize is that the Soviet Union lost 27 million people. That's 1/3 of all combined deaths in World War II. 1 out of every 3 lives lost in the entire war was Soviet. And of those 6 million Jews, 2 million were Soviet. In total, 1 out of every 5 Soviet citizens was killed by the Nazis. The greatest human loss out of any nation, yet their sacrifice is barely mentioned, if at all. Still, the Soviets didn't give up. Under Stalin, the Red Army launched one of the largest counteroffensives in history. Franz Halder, the man who oversaw the German invasion of the Soviet Union, kept a meticulous daily journal. In his journal, he explained, "The Russian troops now as ever are fighting with savage determination and with enormous human sacrifices. The stubborn resistance of individual Russian units is remarkable. Bunker crews have blown themselves up with their bunkers rather than surrender. Now, for once, our troops are compelled by the stubborn Russian resistance to fight according to their combat manuals. In Poland and in the West, they could take liberties, but here they cannot get away with it." The Red Army crushed the Nazi resistance with such force and tenacity that they were responsible for 80% of all German military deaths in World War II. 4 out of every 5 German soldiers who died in World War II died fighting the Soviets. But how did this happen? How did the Soviets do it? Sheer determination, as stated before, but also incredible strategy. While Hitler was focusing his efforts on Western Europe, Stalin was already preparing for what he believed was inevitable. The non-aggression pact with Germany bought him time that he didn't waste. He ordered entire factories to be dismantled and moved into Siberia and behind the Ural Mountains, far beyond the Nazi reach. He had engineers developing new technologies, ordered the work week to be extended, and had production of military equipment running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Under Stalin, the USSR developed military strategies that the Germans had never encountered. While other nations sent every soldier to the border all at once, the Soviets fought in waves. When the first line was broken, it merged with the line behind it. growing stronger with each break. But it wasn't just Stalin and the military. It was the entire Soviet population. Every man and woman, from children to the elderly, worked and fought. And I mean that quite literally. Entire populations of villages and cities took up arms and made weapons from what they had to fight the Nazi soldiers. They even destroyed their own homes, farmland, and infrastructure rather than let the Nazis use it to fuel their army. Once everything was reduced to cinders, they would hide in the forests and wait for the Nazis to arrive. The Russian people have a word for this kind of unity: Соборность. It's a term describing the act of people working together for the greater good of the community, rather than only looking out for yourself. As I've read through the history of the Russian people, I believe this is at the core of their spirit, and it is what truly allowed them to overcome what could have been the extinction of their people. If the Nazis supposed the Soviets would stop at their own border, they would have been mistaken. They kept going. The Soviet army swept across Nazi-occupied Europe, liberating each country and every concentration camp they found. They kept marching the Germans back all the way into Germany and into Berlin. This is the truth most Westerners aren't taught. By the time of D-Day, Hitler's forces had already been bled dry, and it was the Soviet Union that delivered the final blow. It was not an American or British flag that flew over Berlin. It was the Soviet flag, raised over Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Nazi power, their parliament.
Про того, которого любила, про того, чьи письма берегла. Ой, ты песня, песенка девичья, ты лети за ясным солнцем свет, и бойцу на дальнем пограничье от Катюши передай привет.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
But even after everything the Soviet Union had suffered and achieved, political maneuvering had already begun. On May 7, 1945, the Western Allies accepted Germany's surrender in Reims, France, arranged without proper Soviet participation. Nazi Germany, after Hitler's death and under their new leader, Karl Dönitz, attempted to surrender only to the Western Allies while continuing to fight the Soviets. Dönitz believed the British and Americans would treat Germany more leniently than the Soviets, so he tried to move as many German troops and civilians as possible into Western territory for protection. German soldiers and refugees were already fleeing westward to British and American forces, seeking protection from the advancing Red Army. And despite the Soviet victory in Berlin, German units continued fighting the Red Army in other regions for months. The Soviets did have a representative present at Reims, but he was not authorized to sign. Stalin rejected the Reims document as a preliminary or even a separate peace, and he demanded a second formal surrender to be signed on May 8th in Berlin, this time with a proper Soviet representation in the room. By the time of the signing, it was already past midnight in Moscow, May 9th. That's why Russians celebrate on 9 Maya, the 9th of May. The first Victory Day parade was held on June 24, 1945. Even though the Soviet Union was victorious, the grief was so overwhelming that for decades after, Victory Day wasn't a day of celebration, but instead a day of mourning. Almost everyone lost a family member, and many families were completely wiped out. There were only a few more parades after that, on significant anniversaries, until 1995, when the Russian Federation held its first annual Victory Day parade on May 9th. Today, while memorial services still honor the millions that died, the modern holiday also celebrates the strength of the Russian people and the pride in their victory, resilience, and unity. 2025 marked the 80th anniversary of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany, and Moscow hosted a beautiful parade in the Red Square, attended by nearly 30 foreign leaders, and with foreign militaries marching in the parade as well, including militaries from countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. But Moscow wasn't the only place to celebrate. Victory Day is celebrated all over Russia, even all the way in Siberia. Here we are celebrating Victory Day in the city of Irkutsk, where the festivities lasted from early morning until late at night. Beginning at 10 a.m., a memorial was held at the Eternal Flame, a monument with a continuous flame which symbolizes the eternal memory and gratitude for those that died in the war, and to commemorate the veterans of World War II. After that, while we waited for the military parade, we walked around and looked at the items that were being sold at the flea market set up for the day, where people sold locally made products and other things associated with Victory Day. The military parade started at 11 a.m. with marching, patriotic music played by live army bands, and a display of historic military vehicles from World War II and beyond. For example, here's a beautiful Soviet T-34 tank from World War II. And of course, the iconic Soviet Katyusha. I know it seems strange for Americans to see something like this parade. We are given very negative associations with military parades, but to me, it all made sense after I learned exactly what Russia had been through and the pride they felt in protecting their people and their land. It was a deeply powerful and moving feeling. This Russian intercontinental ballistic missile launcher was so huge, I could hear it and feel it shaking the ground before I could even see it. It was just incredible. After the parade, the Eternal Regiment took to the streets. Every year, people join this deeply personal tribute, walking with large posters of their loved ones, relatives who fought and died in World War II. The procession stretched on, and it was incredible to see just how many families came to honor their family members. Throughout the day, the city was filled with music, concerts, and dancing. Stages were set up everywhere, and it was amazing to watch the talent from all around the city perform. In America, we might have silly contests like hula hooping or pie eating, but here the games are a tribute to what it took to survive. You'll see people competing to assemble a rifle, or learning to assemble a rifle, a skill that 80 years ago, every man and woman in the city had to know just to stay alive. These are contests of strength and resilience. It isn't about aggression, but about honoring the history. There is a deep respect for the arts and creativity here. They were performing all over the city from morning until the middle of the night. Being here and witnessing it all firsthand, I realized how important this holiday really is to the people of this country. And afterwards, I started deeply researching the history. I realized that this side of history isn't taught where I come from, not in schools or books or even in documentaries. I couldn't find unbiased information anywhere all in one place. I had to dig and research for over a year to find it, translating from German and Russian in many cases and piecing it all together. But I wanted to make a video that really honored this special holiday. There's so much more I could have said and shown, but then this would have been a very long video, so I just went over the very basics of what I found out. The concerts lasted until 10 p.m., at which point we all headed to the Angara River to watch a beautiful firework display.